Okay, this story takes place in Guatemala. I'm still talking about the Lighthouse Christian Ranch, okay? On February 12th, 1976, at 3:01 a.m., Guatemala was hit with a 7.5 earthquake. It was about 100 miles north of the capital, Guatemala City. Anyway, most adobe homes in the area collapsed immediately. Other structures were damaged beyond repair, and all major systems were interrupted: gas, electricity, communication, transportation. The roads were torn apart. Due to the timing, most people were asleep in their homes, which led to the unusually high death toll of 23,000. Anyway, an additional 77,000 were injured, and 1.2 million were left homeless. So this apocalypse covered 30,000 square kilometers and overwhelmed approximately 3 million people that were affected by this. The government of Guatemala immediately sent out a request for international help, and the world community responded. Canada and Belgium each rebuilt a village, and the USA tackled rebuilding all the roads. Many others rushed in as well. 32 of them came from the ranch. With their newfound faith, the daily headlines took on new meaning for these residents there at the ranch. They knew hunger, they knew homelessness from their youth, and they knew what it was like to feel hopeless. And they just wanted to help. One by one, they approached Jim Durkin separately, he said, and he asked if he would help them get to Guatemala. And he tried to warn them it wasn't going to be like the ranch, like living there in Northern California. It was going to be rough. But they were convinced, so they found the funds and they sent them. And many of them stayed. And they built homes, they founded churches, and they just stayed to do missionary work. And it became a tradition after that to leave the ranch and move out into other areas with needs as the opportunities presented themselves. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, former ranch members established ministries in California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, Guatemala, Ecuador, Nicaragua, the United Kingdom, and Germany. All these people went out from that one small ministry in Northern California. I'd like to say that everything was perfect, but it was life and it was people, and you seldom find perfection. And I think if you talk to families, you don't find it even within families. Mistakes were made. By the time I arrived in town in 1981, they'd pretty much worked out most of the bugs. But you can imagine there were some growing pains. I don't know how many bathrooms they had on the ranch, but I'm sure it wasn't enough for 300 people. And how did they decide who was going to wash the dishes? Ironically, they adopted a fairly conservative form of Christianity, which carried its own baggage as well. So one former member put it this way: it was a male-dominated structure. If you were sick, you were treated as if you were filled with something demonic. So that was very similar to the churches I grew up in. It was male-dominated. Women weren't even asked to pray, and usually, it's pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So illness wasn't frowned on. We prayed for you, but it wasn't that big a deal. Anyway, while she was living there at the ranch, she worked hard to be humble and spiritual, but she got tired of cooking and cleaning for the hordes that came in. She felt like she was kind of given the bulk of the cleanup work. She says, I yearn to live in a real house with my new husband. And that's when I think they started making new rules. People move on. Anyway, they never really had enough room for families, so they made a rule that when you marry, you move on. It was always hard to balance the workload. Newcomers took a while to get up to speed, and others that were there longer had to pick up the slack. And it was just too much for one person to do it all. There were lots of community meetings, trying to talk it out. But inevitably some felt like they were left out of the decision making. Everyone shared equally, but most usually felt we were doing more than our share, and sometimes it was quite easy to measure. Those who worked off campus kicked in their entire paychecks to the community bank. Imagine that, your whole paycheck, whether it was $100 or $1,000, and they got the same small allowance in return. Of course, there was a simple remedy if they didn't like it. They could just leave, and then they could keep the whole check, and the community would usually even help them get started their first month, get a deposit on a new place. Most of the ranch people I came in contact with at Tri-City Weekly, the newspaper, were former members. They were married, they had kids, and they were living in their own homes or apartments, and about 4 or 5 of them owned shares in the Tri-City Weekly, or they were employees there with a paycheck. They had fond memories of the ranch. In fact, I don't think any of them ever shared anything negative. They might have said they had negative experience, but they didn't have anything bad to say about it. But they didn't really want to return either, any more than we might want to go back and live with mom and dad. Once you're married and you have kids, you don't really want to go back home again. Instead, their lives were quite traditional. They worked, they took care of their immediate family, and they would see all their old friends at church on Sundays. They all went to church together. The ranch turned out a tremendous number of pastors and missionaries, but they produced far more people who lived lives not very different from their neighbors. They were workers, they paid their bills, they put their kids in the schools. It was just normal, regular, everyday taxpayers and voters, yeah. And I think that was a good thing. Somehow it all worked out, and people stepped into some very normal lives, like Dan and Maureen. Dan became a doctor, Maureen became a nurse, and the tremendous, overwhelming, passions of youth that had almost destroyed them, they had tamed. And I don't really know how they did it. How does any of us do that? But somehow they had. And the ranch was where it happened.